The world did not arrive at the edge of 2026 with sirens blaring or skies on fire. There was no single moment that announced a turning point, no global event that could be circled on a calendar and labeled as the beginning of collapse. Instead, what emerged as 2025 drew to a close was something quieter, heavier, and more difficult to define. A shared sense of strain, a feeling present across continents that too many systems were being asked to carry too much weight at the same time. Political debates grew sharper, yet strangely emptier, repeating familiar arguments without producing resolution. Economic indicators sent mixed signals, growth in one column offset by fragility in another, as debt climbed and confidence thinned. Environmental reports spoke less about prevention and more about adaptation, an unspoken admission that certain thresholds had already been crossed. And beneath it all, social trust, the invisible glue that allows societies to function even under pressure, showed signs of erosion. None of this felt like sudden disaster. Seen through this lens, it felt more like exhaustion. This is the context in which 2026 begins, not as a year marked by destiny or doom, but as a moment when accumulated pressures finally converge. Interpreted as a stress test rather than a prophecy, the year takes on a different meaning. Stress tests are not designed to predict failure. They exist to reveal where structures are strong, where they are flexible, and where they are quietly cracking long before collapse becomes visible. In this sense, 2026 is not asking what will happen to the world. It is asking what the world has already become. It is precisely in moments like this that the name Baba Vanga resurfaces. Not because her words offer simple answers, but because they resist simplicity altogether. Unlike modern futurists who rely on charts, projections, and clean timelines, she is remembered for something far less concrete. Her visions, as documented by those around her, arrived as fragments, images without labels, sensations without dates, pressures without instructions. They were not meant to be read as predictions to be checked off against history, but as impressions that would only make sense once humanity reached the conditions she sensed. Aligned with that approach, the relevance of 2026 does not lie in a single foretold event. It lies in convergence. Multiple global systems, each strained in different ways, now press against their limits simultaneously. Political systems strain under polarization, where compromise becomes synonymous with weakness and governance turns performative. Financial systems buckle under layers of accumulated obligation, sustained less by productivity than by belief. Environmental systems signal that past assumptions about stability no longer hold. And perhaps most critically, informational systems overflow, producing endless data while shared understanding collapses. Baba Vanga reportedly warned that when trust fades, even strong nations begin to drift. Not drift outward into chaos, but inward, losing alignment between their people, their leadership, and their values. This idea, interpreted as symbolic rather than literal, offers a powerful framework. Empires, in this view, do not fall because an enemy breaches their borders. They weaken when internal coherence dissolves, when citizens no longer recognize themselves in institutions meant to represent them, and when leadership speaks in abstractions detached from lived reality. What makes this interpretation unsettling is how closely it mirrors the emotional landscape of the present moment. Across cultures, many people describe a sense of being overwhelmed. Too much information, too many demands, too many crises competing for attention, each framed as urgent, each unresolved. The result is not panic, but fatigue. A tiredness that dulls civic engagement, and replaces long-term thinking with short-term survival. Baba Vanga is often associated with dramatic visions, yet one of the most consistent themes attributed to her is far quieter: overload. She spoke, according to secondary accounts, of future years when humanity would feel crowded, economically, informationally, psychologically. In such conditions, she suggested, societies would be tested not by war, but by pressure. Pressure to adapt, pressure to listen, pressure to simplify systems that had grown too complex to manage. When viewed this way, 2026 is not a prophecy year. It is a diagnostic moment. This perspective also reframes the idea of collapse. Collapse, in popular imagination, is sudden and spectacular. Markets crash overnight, governments fall in days, cities burn. But collapse as a process looks different. It unfolds slowly, beginning with misalignment. Decisions made for appearances rather than outcomes. Institutions preserved out of habit rather than effectiveness. Narratives repeated long after they cease to reflect reality. Long before anything breaks visibly, the system stops responding. Baba Vanga did not believe history moved in straight lines. Interpreted accounts describe her worldview as cyclical. Periods of expansion followed by saturation, innovation followed by rigidity, growth followed by exhaustion. Collapse, when it came, was not an end but a reset, clearing space for structures better suited to new conditions. Within this cycle, size offered no protection. In fact, excessive scale could become a liability. Systems that grew too centralized, too rigid, too complex often failed under their own weight. Adaptability, in contrast, mattered more than dominance, listening more than control, balance more than speed. These ideas feel almost counterintuitive in a world that still measures success through expansion and influence. Yet, aligned with current conditions, they resonate deeply. The most pressing challenges facing societies today are not those that can be solved through force or volume, but those that require coordination, trust, and patience. As 2026 approaches, the question therefore shifts. It is no longer which nation is strongest, richest, or most feared. It becomes which systems can bend without breaking, which societies can absorb pressure without turning on themselves, which institutions can reform before crisis makes reform impossible. Baba Vanga's relevance, interpreted carefully, lies not in naming winners or losers, but in highlighting the conditions under which change becomes unavoidable. This is why 2026 feels different. Not louder, not darker, but heavier. Like a structure bearing weight it was never designed to carry indefinitely. Some beams will flex, others will splinter. Most will reveal weaknesses that were always there, simply hidden by momentum. This isn't fear, it's awareness. And awareness, when it arrives before collapse, still leaves room for choice. To understand why moments like 2026 carry such symbolic weight, it helps to step away from the modern habit of treating the future as a schedule. Baba Vanga, as she has been remembered, did not speak in dates neatly paired with outcomes. There were no lists of countries matched to years, no timelines stretching cleanly into the decades ahead. Instead, those who documented her words described something far less precise and far more unsettling. A woman who perceived direction rather than destination, pressure rather than event. Seen through this lens, the future was not a fixed path, but a field of forces. She spoke of momentum building in unseen ways, of years that would feel unstable, not because disaster struck, but because humanity could sense the ground shifting beneath long-standing assumptions. The significance of a particular year, therefore, was not what happened within it, but how many unresolved tensions converged at once. This approach challenges how prophecy is usually consumed. Most people look for confirmation, for clear evidence that a prediction came true. But Baba Vanga's worldview, interpreted carefully, resists that simplicity. Her visions arrived as symbols, sensations, recurring images: water, movement, crowding, silence. These were not instructions, they were impressions, meant to be understood only when reality began to echo them on its own. History, as she reportedly understood it, did not unfold in straight lines. It moved in cycles. Tension followed by expansion. Expansion followed by excess. Excess followed by exhaustion. And exhaustion, inevitably, followed by some form of collapse or renewal. What collapsed was rarely civilization itself, but the structures that no longer matched the needs of the people living within them. One of the most consistent ideas attributed to her is that empires do not fall because of enemies. They fall because alignment is lost. When leadership speaks one language, institutions operate in another, and the population feels unheard by both. Decline begins quietly. Power may still appear intact. Borders remain guarded, markets continue to function. But internally, cohesion weakens. Interpreted this way, collapse is not dramatic. It is subtle. It begins when decisions prioritize appearance over function. When systems grow so complex that no one fully understands them, yet everyone depends on them. When rules multiply faster than trust, and control replaces communication. In such conditions, pressure accumulates invisibly, much like stress along a geological fault. Baba Vanga also expressed deep skepticism toward excessive centralization. She warned that systems growing too large, too rigid, and too interconnected could become fragile rather than strong. The more components depended on one another without flexibility, the more likely failure in one area would cascade across the whole. Listening, in her view, mattered more than commanding. Adaptation mattered more than scale. These ideas feel particularly relevant when applied to the modern world. Globalization created unprecedented efficiency, but also unprecedented interdependence. Supply chains stretch across continents. Financial markets react instantly to distant events. Information circulates faster than it can be processed. Under normal conditions, this creates growth. Under stress, it creates vulnerability. Baba Vanga reportedly spoke of future years when humanity would feel overloaded. Too much information, too much pressure, too many competing demands, while inner clarity diminished. This overload, she suggested, would test societies more severely than open conflict ever could. War, after all, clarifies priorities. Overload confuses them. By this interpretation, the importance of 2026 lies not in what begins, but in what becomes impossible to ignore. Long-standing contradictions surface at once. Economic systems promise security while generating anxiety. Political systems claim representation while deepening division. Technological systems connect billions while eroding shared reality. Each system continues to function, yet none fully resolves the strain it produces. In Baba Vanga's worldview, such moments were not endings. They were thresholds, points at which cycles turn, not because of prophecy, but because of accumulated imbalance. The future, she believed, rewarded those who sensed these shifts early and adjusted accordingly. Those who clung to old structures out of pride or fear found themselves overwhelmed when adaptation was no longer optional. Importantly, she did not frame this process as moral judgment. Decline was not punishment. Rise was not reward. Both were consequences of alignment or misalignment with changing conditions. Societies that listened inwardly maintained cohesion, and balanced tradition with innovation tended to endure. Those that relied on momentum alone eventually stalled. This interpretation also explains why her words resist direct quotation. Symbols lose power when reduced to specifics. Names and dates narrow meaning. By remaining ambiguous, her visions invite interpretation only when reality provides context. In this way, prophecy becomes less about predicting the future and more about recognizing patterns repeating themselves under new conditions. As the world approaches 2026, these patterns feel increasingly familiar. Institutions appear strong, yet struggle to respond effectively. Leadership changes hands, but fundamental issues persist. Public discourse grows louder while mutual understanding shrinks. It is not collapse in the cinematic sense. It is strain in the systemic sense. And this is where Baba Vanga's perspective becomes most relevant. She did not ask which nation would dominate. She asked which systems could adapt under pressure, which societies could maintain internal coherence when external conditions shifted, which cultures could simplify when complexity became a liability. Seen through this lens, 2026 is not a prophecy year. It is a mirror, one that reflects not what will happen, but what has already been set in motion. The answers it reveals depend less on fate and more on flexibility, less on power and more on balance. This isn't fear, it's awareness. When the pressures described by Baba Vanga are interpreted against the backdrop of the present moment, two forces begin to stand out with unusual clarity. They are not dramatic events, nor are they confined to any single region. Instead, they move quietly beneath headlines, shaping outcomes long before those outcomes are named. The first is fragmentation. The second is adaptability. Together they form the invisible architecture of 2026. Fragmentation does not arrive all at once. It accelerates gradually, often disguised as choice, diversity, or freedom. Political landscapes splinter into hardened camps that no longer share basic assumptions. Economic systems divide between those insulated from shocks and those perpetually exposed to them. Information ecosystems fracture into parallel realities, each reinforcing its own version of truth. Social trust thins as individuals retreat into identities that feel safer than shared purpose. Seen through this lens, fragmentation is not chaos, it is separation. Systems still function, but no longer in harmony. Coordination becomes difficult. Consensus feels impossible. Even when solutions exist, agreement on what the problem is cannot be reached. Baba Vanga reportedly warned that when societies lose shared reference points, even small stresses can produce outsized reactions. Not because the stress is severe, but because nothing absorbs it evenly. This fragmentation accelerates under pressure. As economic uncertainty rises, political language hardens. As environmental challenges intensify, migration increases, amplifying cultural strain. As technology evolves faster than moral or legal frameworks, trust in institutions erodes. Each system feeds the others, creating a feedback loop that feels relentless yet strangely familiar. The second force, adaptability, emerges almost as a counterweight. In environments where fragmentation dominates, rigid systems struggle. Flexibility becomes survival. Baba Vanga believed the future would reward societies capable of adjustment rather than assertion. Those that listened inwardly, refined rather than expanded, and prioritized cohesion over conquest. Adaptability, however, does not look like rapid change for its own sake. Interpreted carefully, it resembles balance. The ability to absorb pressure without fracturing, to evolve without discarding identity, to modernize without severing cultural continuity. In a fragmented world, these qualities become rare and therefore powerful. This is why 2026 appears less as a moment of dramatic reversal and more as a sorting mechanism. Fragmentation exposes weakness. Adaptability reveals resilience. Systems designed for stability under predictable conditions falter when unpredictability becomes constant. Systems designed to learn, adjust, and decentralize quietly gain relevance. Baba Vanga often emphasized that future leadership would not be defined by force, but by gravity, influence that draws others naturally rather than compelling them through dominance. In a fragmented world, this form of influence becomes more effective than traditional power. Nations, institutions, and cultures that solve problems others can no longer manage gain relevance without seeking attention. This dynamic also reframes the idea of rise and decline. Rise does not necessarily mean expansion or visibility. Decline does not require collapse. Instead, influence migrates. It flows away from rigid centers toward adaptable nodes, away from systems built for control toward those built for resilience. By 2026, fragmentation reaches a point where managing single problems is no longer sufficient. Nations are not addressing isolated crises. They are navigating systemic overload. Economic policy cannot be separated from social cohesion. Environmental strategy cannot be isolated from migration and labor markets. Technological advancement cannot be divorced from trust and governance. Each solution impacts multiple systems at once. Baba Vanga reportedly referred to such periods as times when the world grows tired of itself. Not exhausted in a physical sense, but fatigued by complexity. Too many rules, too many narratives, too many competing demands. In these moments, she believed, humanity instinctively seeks simplification. Structures that can be understood, trusted, and adjusted endure. Those that require constant justification weaken. Adaptability, therefore, is not innovation alone. It is the ability to simplify without losing function, to decentralize without dissolving cohesion, to balance competing demands without freezing under contradiction. These qualities do not announce themselves loudly. They operate quietly, often unnoticed until their absence becomes obvious elsewhere. As fragmentation accelerates, the contrast becomes sharper. Some nations and systems double down on rigidity, attempting to enforce unity through control. Others loosen, allowing variation while maintaining core alignment. The outcomes of these approaches diverge slowly at first, then more rapidly as pressure increases. This is where the notion of 2026 as a threshold gains meaning. It is the point at which fragmentation and adaptability become impossible to ignore, where systems either adjust or strain visibly, where influence shifts not through conquest, but through competence under pressure. Seen through this lens, the question is no longer who is strongest. It is who is built for stress, who can bend without breaking, who can hold internal alignment when external conditions refuse to stabilize. Baba Vanga's warnings, interpreted symbolically, point consistently toward this divide. The world does not end in 2026. It reveals itself. And in that revelation, patterns long forming beneath the surface come into focus. Some will recognize them early. Others will resist until pressure makes resistance unsustainable. The difference between rise and decline begins here, long before outcomes are named. This isn't fear. It's awareness. When the forces of fragmentation and adaptability are applied to the global landscape, certain patterns begin to repeat, not as predictions, but as alignments. Baba Vanga rarely, if ever, spoke in the language of national names. Instead, she described characteristics, civilizations that carried deep historical memory, societies positioned at crossroads rather than centers, nations that gained relevance not by conquering others, but by solving problems quietly when existing powers became constrained. Seen through this lens, 3 countries begin to stand out in the approach to 2026, not because destiny selected them, but because conditions favor what they already are. India emerges first, not as a sudden superpower, but as a stabilizing presence in an unstable system. Interpreted symbolically, Baba Vanga often referred to ancient civilizations reclaiming their voice at moments when older powers grew exhausted by internal strain. India fits this pattern with striking consistency. Its influence does not come from ideological expansion or military projection, but from internal momentum. A youthful population fuels domestic demand. Digital public infrastructure connects millions at scale. Growth is driven less by external dependency and more by internal circulation. What distinguishes India in this context is balance. It advances technologically without severing cultural continuity. Artificial intelligence research, digital governance platforms, fintech ecosystems, and space exploration develop alongside long-standing traditions rather than replacing them. Politically, India maintains strategic autonomy, resisting full absorption into rival blocs. Baba Vanga reportedly warned that nations bound too tightly to global confrontations would fracture under pressure. India's refusal to align completely mirrors an adaptive instinct, flexibility over loyalty, balance over allegiance. Influence, in this case, accumulates quietly. As global supply chains diversify and power becomes more regional than imperial, India's relevance grows naturally. It attracts partnerships without demanding submission. It absorbs pressure without broadcasting dominance. Aligned with Baba Vanga's symbolic language, this is soft gravity, not force. The kind of leadership that emerges not because it declares itself, but because others begin to rely on it. Indonesia follows a similar pattern, though shaped by geography rather than history. Baba Vanga often spoke in imagery of water, movement, and islands gaining importance as oceans transformed from barriers into arteries. Interpreted through modern conditions, Indonesia stands at the center of some of the world's most vital maritime routes. Energy, food, and manufactured goods flow through its surrounding waters. Control here is not about conquest, but stability. By 2026, Indonesia's role is less about ambition and more about positioning. It acts as a regional balancer in the Indo-Pacific, maintaining neutrality amid intensifying great power rivalry. Baba Vanga warned that nations dragged into confrontations not of their making would weaken internally. Indonesia's strategic restraint reflects an understanding that long-term influence grows from steadiness rather than provocation. Demographically strong and rich in natural resources, Indonesia invests in infrastructure, digital connectivity, and renewable energy. These choices do not generate dramatic headlines. They build resilience. Baba Vanga often suggested that the most enduring shifts would be underestimated when they first appeared. Indonesia's rise does not feel like a surge. It feels like quiet consolidation. And in a fragmented world, that distinction matters. Mexico completes this trio, illustrating a different dimension of adaptability. Baba Vanga spoke of power changing hands not through invasion, but through proximity and necessity. As global supply chains restructure and long-distance dependency weakens, geography becomes destiny once again. Mexico's proximity to major consumer markets transforms it into a manufacturing and logistics bridge between regions. This shift is not driven by ideology or conquest. It is driven by function. Nearshoring accelerates as companies seek reliability over maximum efficiency. Mexico absorbs opportunity not because it demands influence, but because existing systems require it. Baba Vanga believed future relevance would belong to those who solved problems others could no longer manage. Mexico's rise reflects this logic precisely. Importantly, none of these countries pursue dominance in the traditional sense. Their influence grows because they align with the demands of a strained system. Internal cohesion, strategic balance, and functional relevance matter more than expansion. Seen through this lens, their rise is not dramatic. It is inevitable under current conditions. These patterns do not guarantee permanence. Adaptability is not immunity. But in the approach to 2026, they reveal how influence migrates, away from rigid centers toward flexible connectors, away from ideological assertion toward practical resilience. Baba Vanga's symbolic warnings point consistently toward this shift. What unites India, Indonesia, and Mexico is not culture, language, or political system. It is alignment. Alignment between internal capacity and external demand. Alignment between tradition and innovation. Alignment between restraint and opportunity. In a world under strain, these qualities quietly attract gravity. The rise of these nations does not signal the fall of others yet, but it does signal movement. Power is not disappearing. It is relocating. And as with all such transitions, it begins softly, long before it becomes obvious. Every period of quiet ascent is mirrored by another of quiet strain. Baba Vanga rarely framed decline as sudden collapse. More often, she described it as prolonged pressure, the slow wearing down of systems that once appeared unshakable. Seen through this lens, the nations facing the greatest challenges in the approach to 2026 are not those lacking power, but those struggling to maintain internal alignment as external conditions change. The United States illustrates this tension with particular clarity. Outwardly, it remains a superpower. Its military reach, economic scale, and cultural influence are unmatched in many respects. Yet Baba Vanga warned that great powers rarely fall from external attack first. They weaken internally through erosion of trust and cohesion. By 2026, the United States faces a convergence of such pressures. Political polarization intensifies, turning governance into constant conflict rather than problem-solving. Institutional legitimacy is questioned, not from the margins, but from the center of public discourse. Economic inequality deepens these fractures. While innovation and wealth continue to concentrate, large segments of the population experience insecurity and stagnation. The result is not immediate collapse, but chronic instability. Baba Vanga reportedly described societies in which leaders rotate, yet faith never returns. This pattern suggests a prolonged transition rather than an abrupt ending. Power remains visible, but its gravitational pull weakens. Influence becomes contested rather than assumed. Germany presents a different form of strain. Once the unquestioned industrial engine of Europe, it now confronts the limits of a model built for an earlier era. Baba Vanga warned of European powers losing influence not through defeat, but through rigidity during periods of transition. By 2026, Germany faces structural challenges that resist quick solutions. An aging population strains labor markets and social systems. High energy costs complicate industrial competitiveness. The transformation toward sustainable production tests political consensus and economic resilience simultaneously. Decline here does not mean collapse. It means loss of momentum. Baba Vanga defined such decline as the moment others stop following your lead. Germany remains strong, but its ability to set direction diminishes. In a world that rewards adaptability, even efficient systems can struggle if they cannot pivot quickly enough. Iran's challenges align with another recurring theme in Baba Vanga's symbolic warnings: the danger of prolonged isolation combined with internal dissatisfaction. By 2026, Iran continues to face sanctions, currency pressure, and regional tension. Generational divides deepen as younger populations seek futures that feel increasingly distant. Baba Vanga suggested that when belief fractures between a population and its leadership, instability becomes cyclical rather than episodic. This does not signal disappearance. Iran's history is long and its identity resilient, but sustained pressure reduces leverage. Influence narrows. Uncertainty becomes the norm. In Baba Vanga's framework, such conditions trap nations in long transitions where resolution remains elusive. What unites these three cases is not weakness, but misalignment. Systems designed for dominance, efficiency, or control struggle when conditions demand flexibility, trust, and renewal. External power cannot compensate for internal fracture. Momentum cannot replace cohesion indefinitely. As these pressures unfold, Baba Vanga's broader warning comes into focus. She did not predict winners and losers as fixed outcomes. She foresaw a reorganization. Empires weaken not to vanish, but to make room for new centers of gravity. Regional powers strengthen. Stability becomes more valuable than scale. Balance outweighs ambition. In this context, 2026 is not an ending. It is a crossing point, a moment when 20th century structures strain under 21st century realities. Some nations adapt, others resist. History, as it always has, favors the flexible. As the world moves through this threshold, the question shifts from prophecy to participation. Are we witnessing transformation, or simply repeating old cycles under new names? Baba Vanga's legacy, interpreted carefully, suggests that awareness precedes choice. Recognition precedes change. The future does not arrive suddenly. It accumulates. And by the time it demands attention, it has often been forming for years. 2026 does not close a chapter. It turns a page, revealing what has been written quietly beneath the surface all along. This isn't fear, it's awareness. And awareness, held long enough, has a way of reshaping what comes next.